A racist police officer sees a black woman searching through a nice car and assumes that she is trying to steal it, so he arrests her for no reason. Afterwards, the officer is informed that he just arrested a state attorney. Danielle Lawson stood in the middle of the parking lot, beads of sweat forming on her forehead under the hot afternoon sun. The black SUV in front of her was unlocked. The driver's side door opened wide as she bent over the seat, shuffling through papers and stray receipts in a frantic search for her missing purse. Come on, she muttered under her breath, her fingers moving quickly as she rifled through the mess. She had already been running late when she pulled into the lot, but now she was in real trouble. Her phone buzzed for the third time, the screen lighting up with another missed call from her office. She didn't even bother checking it. Right now, her focus was on finding her purse, where her wallet, ID, and everything else important in her life were stashed. The faint hum of an engine caught her attention, and she straightened slightly, glancing up to see a police cruiser slowly pulling through the lot. The officer behind the wheel looked her way, and she quickly turned back to her car, trying not to draw any more attention. She didn't have time for this. Still, she could feel the officer's eyes on her as the cruiser rolled to a stop. The door opened, and heavy boots hit the asphalt. "Hey!" a rough voice called out. Danielle froze, fingers still on the edge of the car seat. Her heart sank as she straightened up slowly, already anticipating what was coming. She took a deep breath and turned to face the officer. He was a white man, middle-aged, with a hardened face and a scowl that seemed permanent. His uniform was crisp, though he wore his authority with a casual arrogance, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, voice sharp and suspicious. Danielle wiped a bit of sweat from her forehead and took a step back from the car, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm just looking for my purse," she said calmly, keeping her tone even. "I misplaced it somewhere in the car." The officer's scowl deepened. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his hand still resting on his belt, as though ready to act at any moment. Danielle blinked, feeling her stomach tighten. "Like I said, I lost my purse," she explained, gesturing toward the car. "That's what I'm looking for. I'm late for a meeting." "Uh-huh," the officer interrupted, not letting her finish. "Late for a meeting, right? Step away from the vehicle." Danielle bit her tongue. She didn't want this to escalate. Slowly, she stepped away from the car, raising her hand slightly to show she wasn't a threat. "This is my car," she repeated, her voice steady. "I just need to find my purse, and I'll be out of here." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her, a mixture of suspicion and something darker flickering in his gaze. He took a step closer, his posture rigid. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious. You expect me to believe you just lost your purse? In this car?" He glanced at the SUV as if trying to spot some evidence that she didn't belong there. Danielle felt her patience fray. "Yes, it's my car," she said, more firmly this time. "I'm the state attorney. I lost my purse. That's why I'm searching for it." The officer raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile creeping onto his face. "State attorney, huh? You got any proof of that? Because right now, all I see is someone breaking into a car." Danielle's jaw tightened. She didn't need this. Not today, not ever, but especially not now. "I told you, my ID is in my purse," she said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. The officer took another step forward, his hand now resting on the top of his holster. "Yeah, sure. Just step away from the vehicle. Now." Danielle opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She knew how this looked. A black woman alone in a parking lot, rummaging through an SUV without ID. She knew how people like this officer saw her. She also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. With a deep breath, she stepped farther back, away from the open door of the car. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to handle this without letting it spiral out of control. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive either. This kind of situation could go south fast. The officer, meanwhile, seemed to take her compliance as an admission of guilt. He circled the car, glancing inside before turning his attention back to her. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Danielle's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, what? Are you serious? I told you, this is my car." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped forward, grabbing her arm with one hand, while snapping the cuffs onto her wrist with the other. Danielle felt a surge of anger and disbelief as the cold metal locked around her wrists. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his voice cold, "for suspicion of vehicle theft." Danielle couldn't believe it. Her purse was somewhere in that car, but she was the one being treated like a criminal. As he led her toward the patrol car, she cast one last look at her vehicle, feeling a mix of frustration and anger rise in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Danielle sat in the back of the police car, her wrists still cuffed behind her. The seat was hard and uncomfortable, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. She leaned her head back against the headrest, her mind racing. This wasn't how her day was supposed to go. Through the window, she saw Officer Mulligan standing by her SUV, peering inside with his flashlight. Even though the sun was still blazing overhead, the suspicion in his eyes hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger, fed by the assumptions he had already made about her. Danielle sighed and glanced around the empty parking lot. A couple of people had walked by earlier, staring at her in the back of the police car, but doing nothing, their faces tight with discomfort. No one had stepped in to ask what was happening. The door opened suddenly, and Mulligan appeared, his face set in a grim frown. He pulled her out of the car roughly and turned her to face him. "Still no ID?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I told you," Danielle said, her voice steady but clipped. "My purse is somewhere in my car. If you'll let me get it, I can show you everything you need." Mulligan shook his head, ignoring her completely. "You expect me to believe that you're just some law-abiding citizen who lost her purse? Come on, you're trying to steal that car. It's obvious." Danielle took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Look, officer," she said, doing her best to stay calm. "I'm the state attorney. That's my car. If you just check the registration or run a background check, you'll see everything's in order." "State attorney?" Mulligan let out a short, mocking laugh. "Lady, you can't be serious. People like you don't get jobs like that. Now stop lying, and maybe this'll go easier for you." Danielle felt her jaw tighten, the anger bubbling up inside her. "People like me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Mulligan ignored the question, leaning in closer with a sneer. "What I mean is that you're making this harder than it needs to be. You should have thought of a better story." "State attorney," he scoffed. "I've heard worse, but that's up there." Danielle stared at him, her patience thinning. She had spent years working her way through law school, fighting against every assumption and barrier people had placed in front of her because of the color of her skin. Now, standing here, handcuffed, facing this man who couldn't even bother to listen to her, all of that frustration boiled just beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous," Danielle muttered, more to herself than to Mulligan. "Oh, it's ridiculous, all right," Mulligan said, taking a step back and waving another patrol officer over. "You think you can just waltz in here, steal a car, and get away with it because you've got a fancy job title in your head? No way." Danielle shook her head in disbelief. "I'm telling you the truth. Why won't you just run the plates?" Mulligan shot her an irritated look. "Why? So you can buy yourself more time? I know your type. You probably got a record. You think you're smarter than me, but you're not." Danielle had to fight back a retort. She knew better than to argue with someone like Mulligan in this situation. Still, every word out of his mouth felt like a slap in the face. She knew he wasn't interested in the truth. He had already decided who she was. The second officer, a younger man, approached with a clipboard. He glanced at Danielle, then looked back at Mulligan. "Everything all right here?" the younger officer asked, looking uneasy. Mulligan waved a hand dismissively. "Just a routine arrest. She's got some excuse about being the state attorney or whatever. Doesn't have her ID, though, so I'm booking her for attempted vehicle theft." Danielle clenched her fist behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her skin. She couldn't believe this was happening. "You haven't even checked the plates," she said again, her voice firm. Mulligan shot her a glare. "You can stop talking now," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you regret it." Danielle bit her lip, holding back everything she wanted to say. She knew this wasn't the time to push him further. Instead, she kept quiet as Mulligan and the other officer talked amongst themselves. Every second they wasted felt like an insult, a deliberate choice not to see her as anything but a criminal. After what felt like forever, Mulligan finally spoke. "We'll see what the truth is once we get to the station." Danielle didn't resist. She didn't have the energy to fight this any longer. As the door slammed shut behind her, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. This wasn't over. Not yet. She knew the truth would come out eventually. It had to. But the fact that she was being treated like this in the first place was a reminder of everything she had fought against her whole life. And as she stared out the window, watching the city blur past, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone through this exact same thing. People without the power or connections she had. People who had been silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. Danielle knew one thing for sure. When this was over, there would be consequences. Danielle sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. The sounds of the police station echoed around her. Officers walking back and forth, phones ringing, and distant chatter that blurred together. She'd been through these kinds of places countless times, but always from the other side. Now she was the one being treated like a criminal, and the absurdity of it all sat heavy in her chest. Her mind replayed the events of the last hour. Officer Mulligan's sneering face, his complete refusal to listen to her, his dismissiveness when she mentioned her position. He hadn't even checked her plates. He hadn't done any background checks. She had been arrested solely on his assumptions. Nothing more. She tried to shift in the hard, plastic chair she'd been forced into, her hands cuffed behind her. Across the room, Mulligan was filling out paperwork, muttering to another officer who occasionally glanced over at her. There was no urgency in their actions, no recognition of the mistake they were making. Just another day at the office for them. "Hey," Danielle called out, trying to get Mulligan's attention. "Can I at least get these cuffs off? You know this is unnecessary." Mulligan didn't even look up. "Yeah, sure. You just sit tight, and we'll get to that when we're ready," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Danielle sighed, her frustration mounting. She had dealt with difficult officers before, but none as openly hostile as this. She was a state attorney, for God's sake. How was this happening? She had never expected to be in a position like this, especially not for simply looking through her own car. But here she was. After what felt like an eternity, Mulligan finally walked over to her. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table in front of her, his expression still smug. "All right, state attorney," he said, his tone mocking. "You ready to come clean yet?" Danielle looked him dead in the eye. "I've told you the truth from the beginning. I'm the state attorney for this city, and you've made a huge mistake. But you're too wrapped up in your own bias to realize that." Mulligan chuckled. "Bias? Lady, this isn't about bias. This is about you not having any proof, acting all suspicious, and giving me a bunch of excuses. You know how many times I've heard people say they've lost their ID? Happens all the time. You're not special." Danielle took a deep breath, steadying herself. "If you just run a background check or check the plates, you'd know everything you need to. This could have been over by now." Mulligan straightened up, shaking his head. "Background check? Plates? Nah, you don't get to tell me how to do my job. You criminals always think you know better. You're lucky I haven't booked you for resisting." Danielle's hands tensed in the cuffs, but she didn't rise to his bait. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice low but firm. "When this is over, you're going to regret how you handled this." Mulligan raised an eyebrow, but the smirk never left his face. "Is that so? What, you think you're going to scare me? Lady, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen it all. And trust me, whatever little power trip you're on isn't going to work here." Danielle didn't respond. She was done arguing with him. There was no point. She just needed to get out of here and let the truth handle itself. Another officer, the younger one from earlier, walked over and handed Mulligan a clipboard. He glanced at it, then handed it back without even bothering to read what was written. "What about her call?" the younger officer asked, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the situation. "Shouldn't she be allowed to make one by now?" Mulligan waved him off dismissively. "She'll get her call when I say she gets her call," he muttered, turning his back on both of them. "Besides, what's she going to do? Call the mayor?" He laughed at his own joke. Danielle's frustration turned into a quiet, simmering anger. She knew the procedure, and she knew this was wrong. But more than that, she knew that Mulligan didn't care. This wasn't about justice for him. It was about control. And right now, he was enjoying every second of it. A moment later, another officer, an older man with a tired expression, walked in. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Danielle. For a brief second, something flickered in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps. But he quickly masked it and turned to Mulligan. "Mulligan, what's going on with her?" the officer asked, his voice gruff but curious. Mulligan turned to face him, still relaxed, still confident. "Just another case of someone thinking they're above the law. Says she's the state attorney. Can you believe that?" The older officer raised an eyebrow. "State attorney, huh?" he said slowly, glancing at Danielle again. Danielle met his gaze evenly. "That's exactly who I am. If you'd like to check, I'm sure you'll find everything in order." The older officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Mulligan a long, appraising look. "Might be a good idea to run those plates," he said, his tone more neutral now. Mulligan snorted. "I'll get around to it," he said, waving his hand as if it didn't matter. Danielle locked eyes with the older officer, hoping he would be the one to do something. But after a beat, he just turned and walked back to his desk, leaving her in the same position she'd been in for hours. Still handcuffed, still disbelieved, still stuck. She let out a slow breath, staring at the floor. She needed that phone call. She needed someone to come down here and set this straight, because clearly, no one was going to help her unless she forced the issue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mulligan strolled back over, his grin as wide as ever. All right, princess. You want your phone call? You got it. Let's see what kind of favors you can call in." Danielle didn't respond. She just stood up as he uncuffed her, flexing her sore wrists, and walked over to the phone, her mind already focused on who she needed to call. This wasn't over. Not yet. Danielle rubbed her wrists, trying to get feeling back into them after the hours she'd spent cuffed. The phone was a few steps away, sitting on a small metal desk in the corner of the room. It was an old landline, the kind she rarely used anymore, but right now, it was her lifeline. She walked over, her back straight, her movements calm, despite the anger swirling inside her. Mulligan leaned against the wall near the door, watching her with that same smug smile on his face, arms crossed as if he thought this whole situation was amusing. "Make it quick," he said. "Wouldn't want you wasting any more of our time." Danielle ignored him. She picked up the receiver and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Mark Edwards." "Mark, it's Danielle," she said, her voice calm but firm. There was a pause on the other end. She could almost hear him straightening up in his chair. "Danielle? Where are you? I've been trying to reach you." "I'm at the police station," she said, keeping her voice even, though it was hard to keep the frustration out of it. "I was arrested." "Arrested?" Mark's voice was sharp with disbelief. "For what?" She glanced at Mulligan, who was still watching her with that same lazy smirk. "They think I was trying to steal my own car," she said dryly. There was a brief silence, and then Mark sighed. "Which station are you at?" "Central Precinct," Danielle replied, her eyes locked on Mulligan. "And I need you down here as soon as possible." "I'm on my way," Mark said quickly. "Don't say anything else. I'll handle it." Danielle hung up the phone, her fingers tight around the receiver for a moment before she placed it back down gently. She turned to face Mulligan, who raised an eyebrow at her. "So, who's coming to save you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your lawyer?" Danielle's lips tightened into a thin line. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady. Mulligan pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You know, you've got a real attitude for someone in your position. Most people would be grateful to get a phone call. But you think you're special, don't you?" Danielle looked him dead in the eye, her expression unreadable. "I don't think I'm special," she said, "but I do think you're making a mistake." Mulligan chuckled, shaking his head. Sure. I'll believe that when I see it." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Danielle standing alone. She took a deep breath, then sat down in the chair, trying to calm herself. This was far from over, but knowing Mark was on his way gave her some relief. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was one of the best, and they had worked together on many cases. He knew how to handle situations like this, and she trusted him completely. Still, the fact that it had come to this at all was infuriating. She looked around the small, drab room, the walls painted an unpleasant shade of gray, and the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. It was a room designed to make people feel small, powerless, but Danielle refused to let it affect her. She had spent too long fighting for justice in rooms like this to be broken by one arrogant officer's assumptions. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging as she sat there waiting. The door opened occasionally as other officers passed by, glancing at her with mild curiosity but saying nothing. No one bothered to check her background or confirm her identity. It was as if they were content to let her sit there indefinitely, another nameless, faceless person caught in the system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, and Mark Edwards walked in. His tall, lean frame filled the doorway, his sharp gray suit in stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. He looked around the room, his expression tight with controlled anger, before his eyes landed on Danielle. "Danielle," he said, his voice low but calm, "are you all right?" Danielle nodded, standing up from the chair. "I'm fine, but we need to deal with this now." Mark turned to the officer who had followed him in. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge here. Immediately." The officer, younger than Mulligan, shifted uncomfortably and looked toward the hallway. I'll get someone," he mumbled before disappearing quickly. Mark turned back to Danielle, his expression hard. "Unbelievable. They didn't even check your ID?" "No," Danielle said, her voice tight. "They arrested me without doing any kind of background check. Just took me in based on Mulligan's assumptions." Mark clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. "This is completely unacceptable. Don't say anything else. I'll take care of it." They didn't have to wait long. Officer Mulligan re-entered the room, his cocky demeanor slipping just slightly when he saw Mark standing next to Danielle. He paused in the doorway, sizing Mark up. "You must be the lawyer," Mulligan said, his tone still flippant, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. "That's right," Mark said smoothly, "and I'm here to inform you that you've made a grave mistake. You arrested the state attorney without cause, failed to perform even basic checks, and violated her rights. I'm here to see that this is rectified immediately." Mulligan's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "State attorney, huh? That's the story she's been sticking to," he said, trying to maintain his bravado. Mark took a step forward, his eyes cold. It's not a story, it's a fact. And if you don't take this seriously, you'll be dealing with a lawsuit so fast your head will spin. Mulligan's face darkened. You're telling me she's really… Yes, Mark interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She's the state attorney, and you've made a monumental error. For the first time since this all started, Danielle saw the doubt creeping into Mulligan's expression. He shifted on his feet, glancing between her and Mark, clearly unsure of what to do next. Well, maybe if she'd told me that sooner, Mulligan began, but Mark wasn't having it. She did, Mark snapped, and you didn't listen. Now, you're going to fix this? Or I'm going straight to the police chief. Mulligan's bravado was slipping fast. He stood there, frozen for a moment, then muttered something under his breath before turning and storming out of the room. Danielle watched him go, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She turned to Mark, her expression grateful but still tense. Thank you, she said quietly. Mark nodded, his face softening slightly. This isn't over yet. Let's make sure they release you properly, and then we'll deal with the rest. Danielle sat back down, knowing that soon enough, the truth would come out in full, but she also knew this was only the beginning. The damage had been done, and there would be consequences, just not the ones Mulligan had expected. Danielle sat in the interrogation room, her hands resting on the metal table. The room felt colder now, the sterile atmosphere pressing down on her, but her frustration had begun to fade. She knew Mark was handling things, and soon this entire situation would unravel. The door swung open with a creak, and Officer Mulligan entered, his usual swagger slightly diminished. He didn't meet Danielle's eyes right away as he walked to the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with crossed arms. His smirk wasn't quite as sure as before, though he was clearly trying to hold on to it. A few moments later, Mark entered, followed closely by the police sergeant in charge of the precinct, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a tired expression. The sergeant walked in with a sense of authority, his eyes immediately scanning the room. He had the look of someone who'd seen too many situations like this and was already aware something had gone very wrong. Danielle straightened up as the sergeant glanced at her, then at Mark. He cleared his throat and addressed the room, his voice firm. All right, let's get to the bottom of this, he said. I've been informed there's been a serious misunderstanding. Ms. Lawson, you've been detained under the suspicion of vehicle theft. Is that correct? Yes, Danielle said, her voice calm and controlled. But I've explained multiple times that I'm the state attorney for this city, and this is my vehicle. Officer Mulligan refused to check my ID or verify any of my information. The sergeant turned to Mulligan, his expression hardening. Mulligan, is that true? You didn't check her ID? Mulligan shifted uncomfortably but maintained his defensive posture. She said she didn't have her ID. She lost her purse. I followed protocol based on the situation. Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. You didn't follow protocol, Officer Mulligan. You failed to run her plates. You failed to perform any sort of background check. You ignored every piece of information she provided, including the fact that she's the state attorney. Instead, you profiled her and escalated a situation that didn't need escalation. Mulligan clenched his jaw, his face reddening. She didn't have proof on her. I can't just take people at their word. We deal with liars all the time. The sergeant held up a hand to silence Mulligan, his expression stern. That's enough. The issue isn't whether she had ID on her at the time. It's how you handled this from the start. Did you or did you not verify her identity through any other means? Mulligan looked away, clearly uncomfortable. No, he muttered. Danielle watched the exchange, her frustration simmering under her calm exterior. She had tried to reason with Mulligan, had given him every chance to check her information, but he hadn't cared. Now, he was finally being called out for it. Mark took another step forward, his voice rising slightly. And when I arrived, you still refused to acknowledge who she was. You continued to mock her and dismissed my explanation outright. You're not just negligent, Officer Mulligan. You're reckless. The sergeant's eyes narrowed at Mulligan, who was now standing with his arms crossed, his face hardening in defense. You need to learn how to handle these situations properly, the sergeant said. This isn't about catching people in lies. It's about doing your job thoroughly. You didn't do that, and now we've detained the state attorney under false charges. Mulligan scowled, but there was no denying the shift in the room. He was no longer in control, and everyone knew it. I was doing my job, he muttered, his voice quieter now. Danielle finally spoke up, her voice cold and measured. No, you weren't. You were abusing your power. You saw me and made a judgment without any evidence. You ignored everything I said because you didn't believe someone like me could hold a position like mine. Mulligan's eyes snapped to hers, anger flickering across his face, but he stayed quiet. The sergeant sighed and turned back to Danielle. Ms. Lawson, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the way this was handled. We will release you immediately, and this will be thoroughly reviewed. Danielle's eyes stayed on Mulligan as she spoke, her voice unwavering. I appreciate that, but this isn't over. There will be consequences not just for me, but for every person who has been treated this way and hasn't had the power to fight back. The room went silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The sergeant nodded solemnly. Understood. I'll see to it personally that this is addressed. Mark placed a reassuring hand on Danielle's shoulder, and she stood up from the chair, ready to leave the room. But as she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to face Mulligan. You should have listened when I told you who I was, she said quietly, but firmly. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before you judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions. Mulligan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. It was clear he was still unwilling to accept the reality of what had just happened, even as the truth stared him in the face. Danielle walked out of the room with Mark by her side, feeling the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice, for now, was in her hands. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. There were larger battles to fight, and this was just the beginning. The next morning, Danielle found herself back at the police station, walking into the familiar building with an air of determination. Today was different. She wasn't here as a suspect or a victim. She was here as the state attorney, ready to ensure that Officer Mulligan faced the consequences of his actions. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on her, but she had pushed them aside, focusing on what needed to be done next. As she stepped into the meeting room, she saw Chief David Hernandez waiting at the head of the table. He was a tall, stoic man with a serious expression, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. Officer Mulligan was seated to the side, his posture tense. He looked up when she entered, his face betraying a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly masked it with the same hardened expression he had worn the day before. This time, though, it wasn't backed by the same confidence. Danielle nodded curtly at Chief Hernandez, then sat down across from Mulligan. The tension in the room was thick, but Danielle was calm, collected. She knew what needed to be said, and she wasn't going to let Mulligan off the hook. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice even but with a tinge of weariness. Ms. Lawson, I want to first offer a formal apology on behalf of the department for what occurred yesterday. I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that proper procedure wasn't followed. I assure you, this will be dealt with seriously. Danielle met his gaze, her face unreadable. I appreciate the apology, Chief, she said, her tone controlled. But apologies don't change what happened. Your officer racially profiled me, refused to verify my identity, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Mulligan shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He stared straight ahead, not meeting Danielle's eyes, but the discomfort in his posture was evident. Chief Hernandez glanced at Mulligan before continuing. I understand, and I agree that Officer Mulligan's actions were unacceptable, Hernandez said. That's why we're placing him on leave without pay, pending a full investigation. Danielle nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on Mulligan. That's a start. But this isn't just about me. It's about how many people like me get treated the same way and don't have the power to defend themselves. How many people have been in this exact situation, but didn't have someone like Mark Edwards to call, or a title like mine to pull them out. Mulligan shifted again, his discomfort growing more apparent. He finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. Look, I didn't know who you were, okay? If I'd known, things would have gone differently. Danielle raised an eyebrow, her voice sharp. That's the problem, Officer Mulligan. You shouldn't treat people differently based on who they are. You should have followed procedure regardless of my position. But you didn't. You saw a black woman rummaging through a car, and you assumed the worst. Mulligan opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, clearly struggling to come up with a response. His usual bravado was nowhere to be found, replaced by a simmering frustration that he couldn't express in front of his superior. Chief Hernandez stepped in, his tone firm. Officer Mulligan, you were in the wrong, and this investigation will determine the consequences of your actions. You need to understand the gravity of this situation. Mulligan clenched his fists on the table, then spoke, his words clipped and defensive. I made a judgment call based on what I saw. I didn't mean to. To what? Danielle interrupted, her voice cutting through his words. To racially profile me? To ignore every piece of information I gave you? To refuse to even check my plates? You didn't make a judgment call. You acted on your own biases. Mulligan's face flushed with anger, but he swallowed his words, knowing he couldn't argue his way out of this. Danielle continued, her tone steady, but laced with authority. This isn't about you not knowing. It's about how you handled the situation from the very beginning. And frankly, your apology isn't about what you did wrong. It's about trying to protect yourself now that you know who I am. Mulligan's eyes flicked to the floor, his mouth set in a hard line. He looked ready to defend himself again, but Chief Hernandez spoke before he could. "Ms. Lawson is right," Hernandez said, his voice firm. "This department has no place for actions like yours. This isn't just a one-time mistake. This is a systemic problem and it needs to be addressed." Danielle nodded slightly, acknowledging the chief's words, but her focus remained on Mulligan. "You should be sorry for what you did," she said, her voice cold. "But not just because you did it to me." Mulligan glanced at her, his face tight with barely controlled frustration. "I wasn't trying to save it," Danielle interrupted again, not allowing him to finish. "I'm not interested in excuses. What you did was wrong, and now you're going to face the consequences." Chief Hernandez spoke again, his tone more measured now. "Officer Mulligan, you'll be placed on leave effective immediately. A full investigation will follow, and we'll be conducting mandatory training for all officers to address these issues." Danielle stood up, her eyes still locked on Mulligan. "I'll be back when the investigation is over," she said calmly. "And if it turns out that this kind of behavior is part of a larger pattern, believe me, there will be more than just training." Mulligan didn't respond this time. He just stared down at the table, his jaw clenched tightly. As Danielle turned to leave, Chief Hernandez stood up and walked her to the door. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Ms. Lawson," he said. "I assure you this won't be taken lightly." Danielle nodded once. "I hope so, Chief. I really do." With that, she walked out of the room, her head held high. This wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken. Mulligan would face consequences, and the department would be forced to reckon with its failures. But Danielle knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. As she left the station, the weight of the previous day still lingered, but it was lighter now. She had stood her ground, and the truth had been laid bare. Now, she would make sure that this kind of injustice didn't go unchecked again. There was a long road ahead, but Danielle Lawson was ready to walk it. The next day, Danielle walked back into the police station with the same sense of purpose as before. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Mark Edwards, dressed in his usual crisp gray suit, walked beside her, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the support she had. Today's meeting was with Chief Hernandez and Mulligan again, but the air was heavier. The investigation had moved quickly, and the stakes were higher now. As they approached the chief's office, Danielle felt the tension settle around her shoulders, but it didn't shake her resolve. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Inside, Chief Hernandez sat behind his desk, his expression serious but unreadable. Officer Mulligan was seated in the corner, looking more deflated than before, his confidence drained by the growing consequences of his actions. Danielle and Mark took their seats across from the chief, their expressions equally composed. Chief Hernandez nodded to them both before speaking. "Lawson, Mr. Edwards," he began, folding his hands in front of him. "We've completed our preliminary investigation into the incident, and we've come to a decision. Officer Mulligan's actions were not only out of line, but directly violated department procedures. We've decided to terminate his employment, effective immediately." Mulligan's face stiffened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak. There was nothing left for him to say. Danielle glanced at Mulligan, but her focus remained on the chief. "I appreciate that the department took this seriously," she said, her voice calm. "But firing Officer Mulligan, while necessary, isn't enough to address the bigger issue." Chief Hernandez nodded slowly. "I agree. That's why we're initiating a department-wide review of our training practices, particularly concerning racial profiling and escalation protocols. This won't be just another check-the-box exercise. We'll be working with external consultants to ensure that every officer in this department understands the gravity of situations like this one." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. "That's a start, Chief, but I want to be clear. This is about more than training. This is about changing the culture of how your officers approach situations like mine. It's about ensuring that people of color aren't automatically seen as criminals or suspects just because they don't fit a certain image. I want to see real changes, not just on paper, but in the way your officers interact with the people in this community." Chief Hernandez met her gaze, his expression serious. "I understand, Ms. Lawson, and I can assure you we're committed to making those changes. This incident has highlighted some deep issues within the department, and we won't let it go unaddressed." Danielle studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. There had been plenty of promises made in rooms like this before, but follow-through was what mattered. She wasn't looking for more empty words. She was looking for action. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the brief silence. "We'll be keeping a close eye on the department's progress," he said smoothly. "And if we find that the necessary changes aren't being implemented, we'll be back to ensure that accountability is enforced." Hernandez nodded again, his expression grim. "I understand. I'll make sure you're kept updated on our progress." Danielle turned her attention to Mulligan, who sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. She wasn't looking for an apology from him. She knew she wouldn't get one, at least not one that meant anything. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook without making her point clear. "Mulligan," she said, her voice steady, "you had a choice that day. You could have done your job properly, listened to me, and checked the facts. Instead, you chose to act on your own prejudices. You assumed I was guilty because of how I looked, and you escalated the situation because you believed you had the power to do so. Now, you're facing the consequences of that choice." Mulligan finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He simply stared at her, resentment flickering in his eyes. Danielle didn't need his response. She had said what she needed to say, and the weight of her words hung in the air between them. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Officer Mulligan, you are dismissed. You can collect your things before leaving the premises." Mulligan stood up slowly, his body tense, and walked out of the office without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room seemed to exhale, the oppressive tension easing slightly. But for Danielle, the weight of the situation remained. She turned back to the chief. "I'll be following this closely, Chief Hernandez," she said. "I'm glad to see the department taking action, but I'll be watching to make sure this isn't just a temporary fix. There's a long way to go." Chief Hernandez nodded. "I understand, Ms. Lawson, and I welcome your oversight. We all want the same thing here: justice and accountability." Danielle stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Mark rose beside her, and they made their way toward the door. Before leaving, Danielle paused and turned back to the chief one last time. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly, "because this is just one officer, one incident. The system is still broken, and it's going to take more than firing someone to fix it." Chief Hernandez gave her a solemn nod, his face lined with the weight of his responsibility. "We'll do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. I give you my word." Danielle didn't respond. Words were only the beginning. As she and Mark walked out of the station, the sun was just beginning to rise over the city, casting long shadows on the streets ahead. She knew this was a victory, but it was just one step in a much larger fight. There was still so much work to do, so many more battles to face. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Officer Mulligan was gone, and the system that had protected him was finally being forced to reckon with itself. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. And for Danielle Lawson, that was something worth fighting for. A week had passed since Officer Mulligan's termination, but the events still weighed heavily on Danielle's mind. She sat in her office, staring out at the busy streets below, the noise of the city barely registering. The battle against one officer's blatant misconduct was over, but it hadn't left her feeling victorious. The system that allowed Mulligan to operate unchecked was still very much intact, and Danielle knew she couldn't rest until real change was in motion. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Chief Hernandez. She picked up the phone, her voice calm, as if bracing herself for whatever was next. "Danielle Lawson." "Ms. Lawson, it's Chief Hernandez," he said, his tone formal, but more relaxed than before. "I wanted to update you on the internal reforms we've started. The department has begun implementing the new training protocols. The consultants are working with us to ensure racial profiling and escalation training is thorough, and I'd like to offer you a seat on the oversight committee to make sure we're staying on track." Danielle leaned back in her chair, processing his words. "I appreciate the offer, Chief. It's a step in the right direction. But I hope this isn't just about making things look good on paper." Hernandez paused briefly before responding. "I assure you, Ms. Lawson, this is about more than appearances. We're committed to making real changes, and your insight would be valuable to the process." Danielle considered his words carefully. "I'll think about it," she said. "I'm not interested in being part of a show. If I join this committee, it's to make sure the work actually gets done, and that it's done right." "Understood," Chief Hernandez replied. "We'll welcome your participation whenever you're ready. And again, I'm sorry for what happened. It's clear there's a lot of work to be done." Danielle ended the call and placed the phone back on her desk. Chief Hernandez's efforts seemed sincere, but she couldn't shake the lingering skepticism that had grown over the years. She had seen too many promises of reform that led nowhere. Too many press conferences, too many public apologies, followed by silence. She rose from her chair and began to pace slowly by the window, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. Mulligan's firing had been a necessary step, but it was just one officer in a system that had been failing people like her for years. She thought about the countless others who had faced the same injustices, but without the power or position to fight back. Her thoughts shifted to the community meetings she had already started organizing. They were small for now, but word was spreading, and more people were beginning to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment. It was clear that Mulligan wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of something much larger, and that was where the real battle lay. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Mark Edwards walked in, his face calm but knowing. He didn't need to ask how she was feeling. He already knew. "Got your message," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. "How are things?" Danielle sat back down, letting out a slow breath. "Chief Hernandez called. They've started the reforms, and he wants me on the oversight committee." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And are you considering it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to be involved, to make sure they're not just checking boxes. But another part of me is tired. Tired of hearing the same promises. Tired of fighting the same fight." Mark leaned forward slightly. "You've always known this wouldn't be easy. But you're in a unique position, Danielle. You can hold them accountable in a way that few others can." Danielle sighed, looking out the window again. "I know. It's just, I want this to be real, Mark. I don't want to be part of something that's all talk and no action. I want real change." Mark nodded, his voice soft but firm. "Then make it real. Be the one who keeps pushing, who keeps asking the hard questions. You've already started to make a difference, but this is just the beginning." Danielle was quiet for a moment, thinking about the meetings, the stories she'd heard from people in the community, people who had been silenced for too long. "I've been organizing community forums," she said. "People are starting to come forward. I'm hearing stories that echo what I went through, but most of them don't have the platform I do. If I take this seat on the committee, I want to bring those voices with me. It's the only way I can make sure this isn't just about me." Mark smiled faintly. "Then do it. If anyone can bring those voices to the table, it's you." Danielle nodded, a sense of clarity settling in. She couldn't let the exhaustion win. There were too many people depending on her, even if they didn't know it yet. The fight was bigger than just one officer, one incident. It was about dismantling the biases and systems that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She picked up her phone and began typing a message to Chief Hernandez. "I'll take the seat on the committee. But understand this. I'm bringing the community with me, and we're not here for half measures." As she hit send, a sense of purpose filled her. The road ahead would be long, but she had never been one to shy away from hard work. Mark stood up, sensing the shift in her energy. "You're doing the right thing, Danielle, and I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." She looked up at him, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Mark. I'll need all the help I can get." After Mark left, Danielle stayed at her desk. But this time, her focus was sharp. The small victories of the past week were important, but they were just the foundation for the larger work ahead. The system wouldn't change overnight, but brick by brick, case by case, she was determined to tear down the walls that had kept so many people trapped for so long. Danielle leaned back in her chair and let her mind settle on the work still to come. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The fight for justice, for true accountability, was far from over. But Danielle Lawson was ready. As the day turned into evening, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that progress was in motion allowed her to breathe a little easier. She had taken on the system, and now she was part of the force that would change it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice wasn't just an ideal, it was within reach.
The day Desmond decided to humiliate the janitor was the day he unknowingly destroyed his career. Desmond sneers at the new black janitor, deliberately spilling coffee on the freshly mopped floor. "Clean it again," he smirks. "That's what we pay you for." The janitor silently mops while Desmond mocks her natural hair to his laughing colleagues. Her shoulders remain straight, her eyes fixed on her task. The white executives chuckle nervously, their discomfort visible, yet outweighed by their desire to please the VP of Operations. As she turns to leave, he calls out, "Hey, mop girl, you missed a spot!" The janitor locks eyes with him, saying nothing, but her expression promises consequences. Something in her gaze makes Desmond's smile falter for just a second before he recovers with a dismissive wave. Little did Desmond know who was really behind that janitor's uniform. Alice Johnson arrives at Pinnacle Industries on a quiet Monday morning, her designer bag tucked away and replaced with a simple backpack. Her father, Gilbert Johnson, the rarely seen CEO and majority shareholder, asked her to evaluate the company culture before appointing her as COO. Multiple advanced degrees in corporate restructuring and an impeccable track record in turning around toxic workplaces make her uniquely qualified for both roles. 2 weeks as a janitor, Gilbert had said during their private dinner. See how they behave when they think no one important is watching. Alice agreed. Understanding a company's foundation meant experiencing its lowest levels. She reports to facilities management, where her credentials are a carefully crafted fiction. The supervisor hands her a uniform, equipment, and a schedule, with minimal training. Most floors are straightforward, he explains. Watch out for the executive level, especially Mr. Richards. Alice encounters Desmond Richards within her first hour. He emerges from the elevator as she cleans the lobby, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing attention from everyone, except Alice, who continues working methodically. "You're new," he states, not a question. Before Alice can properly introduce herself, he interrupts. "My office needs attention first thing every morning, and stay out of sight during client meetings." His eyes scan her dismissively. "We prefer a certain professional appearance when clients visit." Throughout her first day, Alice observes how other employees take their cue from Desmond. Junior executives mimic his dismissive tone. Administrative staff avoid eye contact. Only Maria from HR and Jamal from IT acknowledge her with basic courtesy, a simple good morning or thank you when she cleans their areas. Alice notes how Desmond's behavior shifts dramatically between different employees. With white colleagues, he's collegial and respectful. With minority staff, his tone becomes condescending, his feedback harsher. These subtle differences would be invisible from an executive office, but are glaringly obvious from her current vantage point. That evening, Alice meticulously documents her observations in a small notebook while cleaning Desmond's office after hours. She notices a folder carelessly left on his desk labeled Diversity Hires Damage Control, with her father's signature at the bottom of a memo. The signature looks wrong. The slant too steep, the loop too narrow. Alice carefully photographs the forged signature, wondering just how deep Desmond's deception runs. 3 days into her role, Alice pushes her cleaning cart past the main conference room. Inside, Desmond addresses department heads, his voice carrying through the partially open door. "These departments are underperforming," he states, pointing to a projection. "Coincidentally, they're also where we concentrated our diversity initiatives last quarter." He emphasizes the word with subtle mockery. "The budget cuts must come from somewhere, and the data makes our decision clear." Alice notices the data lacks context. No mention of these departments' reduced resources or recent staffing changes. She leans slightly closer, her mop accidentally knocking against the doorframe. The room falls silent. Desmond's head snaps toward the sound. "Excuse me," he says to the executives before striding to the door and pulling it fully open. "What are you doing?" His voice is low but sharp. "Just cleaning, sir," Alice responds calmly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Yet you did." Desmond steps into the hallway, partially closing the door behind him. The executives remain visible through the glass walls, watching uncomfortably. "Eavesdropping doesn't fall under your job description." "I wasn't eavesdropping, sir." Alice maintains steady eye contact, though I couldn't help noticing the performance metrics seem to omit several relevant variables. "Excuse me?" "The departments you've targeted for cuts recently had their administrative support reduced by 30%, Alice continues. "That impact doesn't appear reflected in your efficiency calculations." "I wasn't aware janitors had MBAs, Desmond says, loud enough for those inside to hear. His recovery is quick, his tone shifting to theatrical amusement. "Cleaning supplies are in the closet, not the boardroom. You're paid to clean, not think." His colleagues laugh nervously as he returns, closing the door firmly behind him. Alice resumes mopping, noting which executives seemed uncomfortable with the exchange versus those who enjoyed her humiliation. Later, as Alice cleans the women's restroom, Maria from HR enters. After checking they're alone, she speaks quietly. "I'm sorry about Mr. Richards. He wasn't always like this." Maria washes her hands slowly. "Since Gilbert's been away, Desmond's been pushing boundaries, changing the culture. Some of us are just trying to survive until Mr. Johnson returns." Alice nods thoughtfully. "And when will that be?" "The board meeting next week." Maria dries her hands. "Hopefully things will improve then." As Alice leaves that evening, she receives a text from her father. Status report needed. Board pushing for immediate leadership transition. The next morning, Desmond calls an impromptu all-staff meeting in the largest conference room. Everyone means everyone, the email specifies. Alice arrives with other custodial staff positioned at the back of the room. Executives and managers occupy the seats closest to Desmond, creating a visible hierarchy of importance. Pinnacle Industries is entering a critical phase, Desmond begins, standing tall at the head of the table. Our new efficiency protocols will streamline operations and maximize shareholder value. He displays a PowerPoint detailing new expectations, extended hours, reduced breaks, stricter performance metrics. The changes disproportionately affect lower-level employees while executive benefits remain untouched. Questions? Desmond asks, his tone suggesting there shouldn't be any. The room remains silent until Alice raises her hand slightly. Desmond's eyebrow arches in irritation. "The janitor has a question," he announces, generating uncomfortable chuckles. "Go ahead, enlighten us." "These new schedules require staff to stay until 7:30 p.m. 3 nights weekly," Alice says. "Has there been any analysis of how this impacts employees with family responsibilities or childcare needs?" The room grows tense. Desmond's smile doesn't reach his eyes. "What's your name again?" "Alice, sir." "Well, Alice, let me ask you something." Desmond leans forward. "What's your educational background? Where did you get your business degree?" "I didn't say Exactly," Desmond interrupts. "Someone who pushes a mop for a living doesn't understand what it takes to run a successful business. These decisions aren't made lightly, but they are made by qualified professionals." He gestures around the table. "Perhaps focus on cleaning schedules rather than corporate strategy." Several executives snicker. Others stare at their notebooks, visibly uncomfortable. "Now," Desmond continues, "if there are no relevant questions, let's adjourn." As people file out, Desmond calls over his shoulder, "Alice, stay behind. The conference room needs attention before our next meeting." The executives linger, finishing their coffee while Alice waits with her cart. Once the room clears, except for Desmond and 3 senior directors, he begins his performance. "While you're here," he says loudly, deliberately knocking over a half-full coffee cup. The liquid spreads across the polished table. "Oops, clumsy me." His colleagues watch as Alice silently begins cleaning the mess. "You know," says Thompson, a sales director, moving unnecessarily close as Alice works, "there are other ways to advance in a company like this. Some of us could put in a good word if you were nicer to certain executives." Alice maintains her focus on cleaning, her face neutral despite the implication. Desmond chuckles. "Don't waste your time, Thompson. Some people just don't have what it takes to rise above their station." They finally leave, having created additional messes requiring attention. Alice methodically cleans each spill, documenting every word and action in her mental record. Through the glass walls, she notices Jamal from IT watching with obvious concern. That night, Alice calls her father and says, "I've seen enough. It's time for phase 2, earlier than we planned." "He did what?" Gilbert Johnson's voice, though quiet, carries an unmistakable edge through the phone. Alice sits in her modest apartment, janitor's uniform draped over a chair, her notes spread across the kitchen table. "The racism isn't even subtle anymore, Dad," Alice explains, scrolling through photos on her tablet. "Desmond's systematically dismantling your diversity initiatives while forging your approval. The targeted department cuts would eliminate primarily Black and Latino employees." Gilbert sighs heavily. "I knew there were problems, but this—" A pause. "How are your treatments going?" Alice asks, shifting topics momentarily. "Oncologist says I'm responding well. Another reason we need to accelerate the timeline." Gilbert's tone strengthens. "The board meeting is in 3 days. I'll announce you as my successor then." "And until then?" "Continue gathering evidence, leave nothing to chance." After ending the call, Alice stares at her reflection in the darkened window. Her father built Pinnacle from nothing, creating opportunities for people regardless of background. She makes a silent vow, not just to remove Desmond, but to reform the culture completely, honoring her father's original vision. The next morning, Alice cleans the HR department earlier than scheduled. Maria works alone, organizing personnel files. "You're here early," Maria notes with a genuine smile. "I noticed your department gets busy later," Alice replies, carefully mopping around Maria's desk. "Thought I'd get the major cleaning done now." Considerate, unlike some people around here. Maria continues sorting files, then hesitates. "Can I ask you something? How do you stay so dignified, despite how they treat you?" Alice considers her response carefully. "I believe every job has value, and how people treat others when they think no one important is watching reveals their true character." "That's profound for—" Maria catches herself. "For a janitor?" Alice finishes with a small smile. Maria blushes. "I'm sorry. That was exactly the kind of thinking I was criticizing." "No offense taken. We all have biases to overcome." Alice gestures toward the files. "Looks like performance reviews?" "Yes. Desmond wants them reorganized before the board meeting." Maria lowers her voice. "Between us, he's manipulating the data. Employees who challenge him mysteriously receive poor evaluations, especially minorities." Alice nods thoughtfully. "Has anyone reported this?" "To whom?" "HR reports to Desmond while Gilbert's away. Complaints disappear." Maria's shoulders slump. 3 people filed harassment claims last month, all lost in the system." Later, Alice positions her cleaning cart near the IT department, where Jamal works alone troubleshooting a server. "System giving you trouble?" she asks, emptying his trash bin. "Desmond rushed an implementation without proper testing." Jamal doesn't look up from his screen. "Then blamed my team when it crashed. 2 were fired last week, both women of color with perfect performance records." Alice absorbs this information while wiping down surfaces. "That doesn't seem fair." "It's not. But speaking up is dangerous." Jamal finally looks at her. "Why are you interested anyway?" "Just trying to understand the place I work," Alice says simply. Throughout the day, Alice strategically positions herself to overhear conversations, using her invisibility as a janitor to gather intelligence. She befriends security guards with genuine kindness, securing keycard access to all floors when needed. That evening, she makes 2 calls from her apartment. First, to Pinnacle's outside counsel. "This is Alice Johnson, Gilbert Johnson's daughter," she identifies herself. "I need documentation prepared for potential terminations and legal actions. Highest confidentiality required." Her second call reaches colleagues at competing firms who've encountered Desmond at industry events. "I need honest accounts of any racist or discriminatory behavior you've witnessed," she explains. "On the record, with dates and details." Alice updates her files with new information, building a comprehensive case. While reviewing Desmond's email screenshots provided by a confidential source, she discovers something alarming: a detailed plan to present Gilbert with a forced retirement package at the upcoming board meeting, citing his health concerns as justification for immediate leadership change. Alice closes her laptop, her path forward crystal clear. Desmond isn't just targeting employees, he's orchestrating a coup. Desmond strides through the office with newfound confidence the following morning. His coup plans well in motion. He no longer bothers masking his true nature. The executive floor buzzes with tension as he implements a new, enhanced productivity tracking system for custodial staff. "Effective immediately," he announces to the facilities manager loud enough for Alice to hear nearby. "Janitorial staff must check in every 30 minutes via the new app. Any gap in reporting will trigger immediate supervisory review." The facilities manager protests weakly. "Sir, they're cleaning across multiple floors. Having to stop every half hour will actually reduce efficiency." "Are you questioning my directives?" Desmond's voice drops dangerously. "No, sir, I'll implement it immediately." Alice receives her tracking notification minutes later. The system requires her to take photos of completed work areas with facial verification to prove she personally performed the tasks. The requirements border on harassment, clearly designed to humiliate rather than improve performance. By mid-morning, Desmond hosts potential investors in the main conference room. As the catering staff arranges refreshments, he suddenly points toward Alice, who cleans windows in the adjacent hallway. "You, come here." He snaps his fingers. "Our catering seems understaffed today. Serve coffee to our guests." Alice complies professionally, moving to the credenza to prepare the service. She feels the investors watching her uncomfortably as Desmond continues his presentation. "As you can see, Pinnacle Industries maintains exceptional standards at every level," Desmond declares, while Alice carefully pours coffee for the first guest. "Even our support staff represents our commitment to excellence." As Alice serves the lead investor, Desmond sighs dramatically. "Stand straight, please. Proper posture reflects company values." The investor accepts his coffee with a tight smile, making direct eye contact with Alice. "Thank you," he says pointedly. After the investors depart, Desmond corners Alice in the supply closet. "You deliberately made me look bad in there," he hisses, blocking the doorway. "I simply did what you asked, Mr. Richards," Alice responds evenly. "Don't play innocent. I saw those looks you exchanged with Davis." His face flushes with anger. "Your attitude is undermining company morale." "My attitude, sir? That's exactly what I mean." Desmond steps closer. "You think you're smarter than your position. Let me be clear. You're replaceable. Dozens would take your job tomorrow." "Is that a threat, Mr. Richards?" "It's a reality check." Desmond checks his watch. "Since you have so much energy for insubordination, you can clean the basement storage rooms. They haven't been touched in years." He walks away, satisfied with his punishment. What Desmond doesn't realize is that he's just granted Alice access to the company's archived records, boxes of documents predating digital conversion, stored and forgotten. Alice spends hours in the dusty basement, methodically examining files. She discovers patterns in personnel records spanning years, successful initiatives started by Black and Latino employees, subsequently credited to white managers in official documentation. Behind many of these reassignments, Desmond Richards' signature. As she organizes the evidence, a sealed envelope falls from between older files. It's addressed to Gilbert Johnson, marked "Confidential, Whistleblower Report." The seal remains unbroken. Inside, Alice finds a detailed complaint about Desmond's discriminatory practices from 3 years earlier, a report that never reached her father's desk. Alice slides the whistleblower report into her pocket, wondering how many other voices Desmond had silenced before they could reach her father. "Come in, Alice. Close the door." Desmond's voice carries artificial pleasantness as Alice enters his office the next morning. The day before the board meeting, his desk appears unusually organized, documents arranged in precise stacks. Alice stands quietly, hands folded at her waist, waiting. Desmond studies her, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You've been with us, 2 weeks now?" He doesn't wait for confirmation. "In that time, you've demonstrated unusual attentiveness to company operations." Alice remains silent, face neutral. "Several people have noticed you taking notes." Desmond pulls her small notebook from his drawer, waving it casually. "Found this in your cleaning cart. Interesting reading." "Those are my personal notes, Mr. Richards." "About Pinnacle employees and operations." His smile tightens. "Given your position, that raises concerns." "I note cleaning schedules and areas needing special attention," Alice responds calmly. "Nothing inappropriate." "Perhaps." Desmond leans back in his leather chair. "But it could be interpreted differently. As, say, gathering information for a discrimination lawsuit?" The accusation hangs in the air. Alice maintains steady eye contact, revealing nothing. "Listen, Alice." Desmond's tone shifts to what he likely considers reasonable. I recognize ambition even in unexpected places. Someone with your observational skills could be valuable in the right position. He slides a folder across the desk. I'm prepared to offer you a promotion to head of facilities management. Significant pay increase, office instead of a cart. All I need is this notebook and your signature on this NDA. Alice glances at the document without touching it. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Richards, but I'm comfortable in my current role. Desmond's facade cracks slightly. Don't be foolish. This opportunity won't come twice. Is there a problem with my performance as a janitor? No, but... Then I'll continue my duties as assigned. Alice takes a small step back. My notes help me remember my tasks, nothing more. The pleasantness evaporates from Desmond's expression. Let me be clear about your situation. I've handled troublemakers before. Jobs are hard to find for people like you, especially with negative references. People like me, Mr. Richards? People who don't understand their place. Desmond stands, emphasizing his height advantage. The board meeting tomorrow will solidify my position here. Changes are coming to Pinnacle, changes that won't favor those who oppose me. Alice maintains her composure, which visibly frustrates Desmond further. Tomorrow morning, you'll clean the executive bathroom during the board meeting, he orders. I want it spotless for the celebration afterward. You're dismissed. After leaving his office, Alice navigates to the IT department where Jamal works alone on a terminal. Need something? He asks, glancing up. Just emptying trash, Alice replies, closing the door behind her. Actually, I could use your help. Jamal's eyebrows rise skeptically. I've noticed concerning patterns in how Mr. Richards treats employees, Alice continues, particularly minorities. Join the club, Jamal mutters, returning to his screen. I'm gathering documentation, evidence of misconduct. Jamal's fingers pause over his keyboard. That's a dangerous game. Sometimes risk is necessary for change. After a long moment, Jamal sighs. What exactly are you looking for? By evening, Alice has secured digital evidence of Desmond's misconduct, including emails discussing managing the diversity problem and directives to hide complaints from Gilbert. Maria from HR quietly provides records of complaints that were supposedly lost. In her apartment, Alice prepares for the next day. She lays out a pristine executive suit, arranges documents in a leather portfolio, and reviews her comprehensive evidence file. Her expression remains calm, but determination radiates from her every movement as she rehearses exactly how tomorrow's confrontation will unfold. As Alice reviews her evidence, Desmond calls his allies on the board. Everything's set for tomorrow. Gilbert won't know what hit him. Morning light streams through Pinnacle Industries' glass facade as executives arrive for the board meeting. Desmond stations himself in the lobby, greeting board members with practiced charm. His tailored suit and confident smile project the image of a leader already assuming control. Alice pushes her cleaning cart through the executive floor, head slightly bowed, invisible to the power players gathering around her. She feels Desmond's eyes tracking her movements, his satisfaction palpable at seeing her in her proper place on this pivotal day. As she wipes down a decorative table near the boardroom entrance, Desmond approaches with two board members. We had some issues with substandard cleaning recently, he announces loudly, ensuring others hear. Standards have slipped in several areas during Gilbert's absence. The board members glance at Alice uncomfortably but say nothing. The executive bathroom needs particular attention today, Desmond continues, addressing Alice directly. I expected immaculate for our post-meeting celebration. He turns to security personnel standing nearby. She's restricted to ground floor and executive bathroom only. No exceptions. The security guard nods, avoiding eye contact with Alice. Yes, Mr. Richards, Alice responds quietly, gathering her supplies. Desmond smirks, believing he's neutralized any potential disruption. He directs the board members toward the conference room with a theatrical sweep of his arm, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Board members continue arriving, taking their seats around the polished table. Conversation quiets as Gilbert Johnson enters last. His frame appears thinner from cancer treatments, but he carries himself with undiminished dignity. Board members rise respectfully as he takes his position at the head of the table. "Gilbert, wonderful to see you," Desmond diffuses, rushing to pull out the CEO's chair. "How are the treatments progressing?" "Well enough," Gilbert responds simply, his expression revealing nothing. "We've all been concerned," Desmond continues, his voice projecting just the right amount of practiced sympathy. "The company has missed your guidance." "Has it?" Gilbert surveys the room. "I'm eager to hear your assessment." Meanwhile, Alice enters the women's locker room carrying her cleaning supplies and a garment bag. Maria waits inside, nervously checking her watch. "Everyone's in the boardroom," she confirms. "Are you sure about this?" "Completely." Alice changes quickly, transforming from janitor to executive. Her tailored suit fits perfectly, her hair now styled in a sophisticated updo. She applies minimal makeup with practiced efficiency, the transformation remarkable yet somehow revealing her true self rather than creating a disguise. "How will you get up there?" "Desmond restricted elevator access," Maria worries. "There's more than one way to reach the top." Alice smiles confidently. "The service elevator bypasses security protocols." In the boardroom, Desmond stands before a polished presentation, digital slides displaying carefully curated performance metrics. "As you can see," he explains, gesturing to color-coded graphs, "these departments consistently underperform despite increased resource allocation. The screen highlights primarily minority-led divisions. My restructuring proposal addresses these inefficiencies through strategic personnel adjustments." Board members review the data with furrowed brows. Gilbert watches silently, his expression unreadable. "Which brings me to a difficult but necessary discussion," Desmond continues, his tone softening. "Gilbert, your health situation requires consideration of leadership continuity, the stress of day-to-day operations during your treatment." He pauses as the executive bathroom door opens. All heads turn toward the unexpected interruption. The boardroom falls silent as Alice emerges not in her janitor's uniform, but in an impeccable executive suit, carrying a portfolio stamped with the company logo and her father's personal seal. Alice walks confidently into the boardroom, her steps measured and deliberate. Desmond freezes mid-sentence, his presentation forgotten as confusion, then recognition, then horror wash across his face in rapid succession. Board members stare in bewilderment at the transformation. The woman they had either ignored or seen being humiliated now commands the room with unmistakable executive presence. Gilbert rises from his chair, a smile breaking through his previously neutral expression. He moves to embrace his daughter, the gesture both professional and warmly paternal. "Board members," Gilbert announces, his voice stronger than it has been all morning. "Meet Alice Johnson, my daughter." Murmurs ripple through the room as connections form in stunned minds. Gilbert continues, "Alice holds 3 advanced degrees, including an MBA from Wharton, and has spent the last decade turning around troubled corporate cultures across multiple industries." He places a hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his gesture. "And as of this moment, she is Pinnacle Industries' new Chief Operating Officer." The silence deepens. Desmond's face drains of color, his knuckles white against the presentation remote still clutched in his hand. Board members exchange glances, processing this revelation and its implications. Alice takes a seat at her father's right hand, calmly placing her portfolio on the table and opening it with practiced precision. Her movements are unhurried, allowing the dramatic tension to build naturally. "Before Mr. Richards continues his presentation," Alice says, her voice clear and authoritative, "I'd like to share my observations from my 2 weeks working undercover as a janitor at my father's request." Desmond finds his voice, though it cracks slightly. "This is highly irregular. We have an agenda, which now includes this report," Gilbert interrupts firmly. "Please continue, Alice." Alice begins methodically outlining the systemic discrimination she witnessed, providing specific dates, times, and witnesses. She references emails, conversations, and decisions documented during her time undercover, painting a comprehensive picture of the toxic culture Desmond cultivated during Gilbert's absence. On Tuesday, March 8th, Mr. Richards explicitly targeted minority-led departments for budget cuts, while presenting misleading performance metrics that omitted crucial context. Alice slides documents toward board members. The original performance data shows these departments actually outperformed expectations when accounting for reduced resources. She continues through her evidence, her delivery precise and unemotional, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Board members leaf through the documentation with increasingly troubled expressions. Perhaps most concerning, Alice continues, placing a folder before her father, is this diversity initiative report bearing your forged signature, creating the appearance that you approved discriminatory policies you had previously rejected. Desmond attempts to interject, but Alice calmly raises her hand. I haven't finished, Mr. Richards. You've had 2 weeks to speak freely while I cleaned your office. She plays selected audio recordings captured during her tenure as janitor. Desmond's voice fills the room, making casually racist remarks, threatening employees' livelihoods and boasting about circumventing Gilbert's diversity mandates. And finally, Alice says, removing the sealed whistleblower envelope, this complaint addressed to my father 3 years ago detailing similar concerns was intercepted before reaching his desk. The pattern is clear and long-standing. Throughout her presentation, Alice maintains absolute composure, a stark contrast to Desmond's growing agitation. He shifts in his seat, loosens his tie, and repeatedly attempts to interrupt only to be silenced by Gilbert's raised hand. When Alice concludes, she turns to her father and the board. This toxic culture doesn't reflect Pinnacle's stated values or my father's vision. Beyond the moral implications, it represents significant legal and reputational liability that threatens the company's future. This is absurd, Desmond finally explodes, standing abruptly. She set me up, planted herself here under false pretenses to fabricate evidence against me. Did I fabricate the recording of you mocking my hair? Alice asks calmly. Or the email where you wrote that diversity hires require extra management to maintain standards? Those statements are being taken out of context. Desmond's defense grows increasingly desperate. In a high-performance environment, certain cultural differences create natural friction. My job is managing that reality, not pretending it doesn't exist. His attempted justification only confirms Alice's accusations, drawing shocked expressions from several board members. And the forged signature? Gilbert asks quietly. A miscommunication with your assistant, Desmond claims, sweat now visible on his brow. She believed you had approved the policy changes before your medical leave. Interesting, Gilbert responds, considering my assistant is sitting right there and confirms no such instruction was given. The executive assistant nods in confirmation, her expression grim. Gilbert surveys the room with quiet authority. I believe we have sufficient cause for an immediate vote of no confidence in Mr. Richards' leadership. The board members, faced with irrefutable evidence and potential legal exposure, vote unanimously to remove Desmond from his position. Security will escort you to clear your office, Gilbert informs Desmond calmly. Company devices and files remain Pinnacle property. As security personnel enter, Desmond's face contorts with rage and humiliation. Alice stands, meeting his furious gaze with composed dignity. You told me cleaning supplies are in the closet, not the boardroom, she says quietly. Today I'm here to clean house. As Desmond is escorted out, he shouts, This isn't over! I have friends in this industry who won't stand for this! The boardroom door closes behind Desmond and security, leaving a charged silence. Board members exchange uncomfortable glances, acutely aware of their complicity through inaction. Gilbert surveys the room with measured disappointment while Alice reviews her notes, giving everyone a moment to process the dramatic shift in power dynamics. I believe we should continue this meeting, Gilbert finally says, his tone businesslike, though clearly with a revised agenda. Over the next 3 hours, Alice presents a comprehensive plan for immediate corporate rehabilitation. Board members listen with rapt attention, their earlier skepticism replaced by growing respect as she outlines specific, actionable steps to address the damage done under Desmond's leadership. Effective immediately, Alice announces, all terminated employees from the past year will receive case reviews to identify potential discriminatory dismissals. Those wrongfully terminated will be offered reinstatement with back pay. She establishes a legitimate diversity task force with real authority and reporting structure directly to the CEO's office. This isn't about optics, she emphasizes. This is about building the innovative culture that drives actual performance. By meeting's end, the board unanimously approves Alice's appointment as COO and endorses her reform agenda. Several members privately expressed shock at how blind they had been to Desmond's manipulation of company data and culture. The following morning, Alice arrives early, now openly occupying the COO's office adjacent to her father's. She reviews personnel files, identifying key allies and enablers of the previous toxic regime. Her office door remains open, a deliberate contrast to Desmond's closed-door approach. "Your 9 a.m. is here," her assistant announces. Thompson, the sales director who had made inappropriate suggestions to Alice during her time as a janitor, enters with forced confidence. "Quite the performance yesterday," he begins, attempting familiarity as he takes a seat uninvited. "Desmond obviously crossed lines, but between us some of this feels like an overreaction." Alice studies him silently before responding. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, what specifically feels like an overreaction?" "Well," he chuckles uncomfortably, "some comments get misinterpreted. Workplace banter isn't always politically correct." "Banter," Alice repeats, "like suggesting a janitor could advance by being nicer to certain executives?" Thompson's smile falters. "That was just joking around, nothing serious." "Interesting." Alice opens a folder on her desk. "Because we have 17 similar jokes documented from you in the past year, directed at female employees. Would you like to hear them quoted back?" "This is ridiculous." Thompson shifts in his seat, tie suddenly too tight. "You can't possibly build a case from offhand remarks." "Actually, we can and we have." Alice slides a document across the desk. "This is your severance agreement, contingent upon a non-disclosure clause. The alternative is termination with cause, which would trigger mandatory reporting to industry oversight boards regarding the harassment claims." Thompson stares at the document, reality finally penetrating his privileged bubble. "You can't do this. It's already done." Alice stands, signaling the meeting's end. "You have until noon to decide which exit you prefer." Throughout the week, Alice conducts similar meetings with executives who enabled Desmond's behavior. Some demonstrate genuine remorse, acknowledging their failure to intervene. "I knew it was wrong," admits the marketing director, voice trembling slightly. "But I have 3 kids in college. I convinced myself staying silent was protecting my family." "Fear is a powerful motivator," Alice acknowledges. "But so is accountability. Are you willing to be part of rebuilding this culture the right way?" Those showing authentic responsibility receive second chances with clear expectations. Others who defend the old culture face termination or voluntary departure with carefully worded agreements protecting the company's interests. By week's end, Alice has restructured the executive team, promoting qualified individuals previously overlooked due to bias. Jamal from IT becomes Chief Technology Officer, his previously ignored cybersecurity proposals now fast-tracked for implementation. Maria advances to Senior Director of Human Resources, tasked with rebuilding trust in a department that had become weaponized under Desmond's influence. In a private conference room, Gilbert and Alice meet with Pinnacle's legal team to address Desmond's misconduct. "We have 3 options," explains the Chief Counsel, sliding folders across the table. "First, internal discipline only. termination with a strong NDA and financial settlement. Second, full cooperation with regulatory investigations but no proactive disclosure. Third, transparent approach. Publicly acknowledge past failures while demonstrating corrective actions. Gilbert looks to Alice. Your recommendation? Option 3, she responds without hesitation. Settlements and NDAs protect Desmond and any company that might hire him. Transparency protects future potential victims. Gilbert nods his agreement. Proceed with full transparency. Pinnacle will demonstrate leadership through accountability, not cover-ups. The decision sends shockwaves through the industry where such behavior is typically settled quietly to protect corporate reputations. Media outlets request interviews, sensing a rare break from the standard damage control playbook. Alice selects one respected business journal for an exclusive feature, using the opportunity to position Pinnacle as taking decisive action against discrimination rather than hiding from past failures. Leadership requires experiencing all levels of company operations, she explains to the journalist. When executives remain isolated in corner offices, they lose touch with the culture that actually drives success or failure. The article publishes with the headline, Undercover Boss's Daughter Exposes Toxic Culture, Pioneers New Approach to Corporate Accountability. Meanwhile, Desmond launches a desperate damage control campaign, contacting allies at competitor firms and spreading misinformation about his departure. Medical differences of opinion with Gilbert, he tells one CEO. Personality conflict with his daughter, he explains to another. His narrative portrays him as the victim of family politics rather than his own misconduct. His strategy backfires spectacularly when 3 former Pinnacle employees, emboldened by Alice's actions, publicly share their experiences of discrimination under his leadership. Their accounts corroborate Alice's findings and add new dimensions to the pattern of abuse. 6 weeks into her tenure as COO, Alice presents her comprehensive reform plan to the board. The detailed strategy becomes a case study in corporate culture rehabilitation, blending accountability with forward-looking innovation. The approach emphasizes dignified treatment of all employees regardless of position, connecting ethical leadership directly to improved performance metrics. Early results prove promising. Employee satisfaction scores rise for the first time in 3 years. Productivity increases across departments previously labeled underperforming. Turnover rates drop significantly, particularly among minority employees. Alice ensures Jamal and Maria receive public recognition for their integrity during the investigation. At the company's quarterly all-hands meeting, she personally acknowledges their courage. Transformation requires allies at every level, she tells the assembled staff. The true measure of our success won't be financial statements, but whether every person in this company feels valued for their contributions, regardless of their title or position. As the meeting concludes, Alice's assistant hurries forward with an urgent message. A legal letter has arrived from Desmond's attorney, claiming wrongful termination and demanding reinstatement with compensatory damages for reputational harm. Alice reads the document calmly, unsurprised by this desperate countermove. As she finishes, her phone buzzes with a notification. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has opened a formal investigation into Desmond's conduct, requesting Pinnacle's cooperation. Alice sets both documents on her desk, knowing the real battle has only begun. Desmond's downfall must be absolute to truly protect the vulnerable throughout the industry. 6 weeks after his termination, Desmond Richards strides into the hearing room with practiced confidence. His expensive legal team flanks him, briefcases bulging with motions and counter-allegations. The polished veneer of his appearance, custom suit, fresh haircut, authoritative posture, projects the image of an executive temporarily inconvenienced rather than a man fighting for his professional survival. The room fills quickly with industry representatives. What began as a standard wrongful termination dispute has evolved into a watershed moment for corporate accountability. HR directors, diversity officers, and legal counsel from competing companies pack the observer seats, recognizing the precedent-setting potential of today's proceedings. Desmond nods to several former colleagues, receiving stiff acknowledgments or awkward glances in return. His attorney leans close, whispering reassurances about their strategy. They plan to portray Alice as privileged and manipulative, the entitled daughter orchestrating a calculated takeover at any cost. "All rise," announces the bailiff as the three-person arbitration panel enters. Unlike typical employment disputes handled privately, Desmond's aggressive legal filings and public statements have transformed this into a formal hearing with binding authority under industry governance rules. Alice sits at the respondent's table, her expression composed and attentive. Gilbert joins her in support, though she leads the defense herself. Their legal team appears notably smaller than Desmond's arsenal of attorneys, projecting quiet confidence rather than overwhelming force. Desmond's lead counsel opens with precisely the narrative they telegraphed, casting him as victim of nepotism and corporate politics. Mr. Richards implemented necessary performance standards that sometimes proved uncomfortable for underperforming employees, the attorney argues. Ms. Johnson, with no operational experience at Pinnacle, engineered a deceptive scheme to remove him, manufacturing a discrimination narrative to justify a daughterly coup. Alice allows the characterization to stand unchallenged for now, taking careful notes rather than displaying any reaction. Desmond testifies first, presenting himself as a dedicated executive making difficult but necessary business decisions. "Performance metrics don't lie," he insists, gesturing toward charts displaying departmental statistics. "The divisions we targeted for restructuring objectively underperformed. That some were led by minorities reflects hiring patterns predating my leadership, not discriminatory intent." He portrays Alice's undercover operation as corporate espionage and entrapment, designed to manufacture evidence rather than discover truth. His testimony seemed to resonate with at least one panel member, whose questions suggest skepticism about Alice's methods. The momentum shifts when Alice begins cross-examination, her approach methodical rather than confrontational. "Mr. Richards, these performance metrics you've presented, who selected the evaluation criteria?" she asks. "I did, with my executive team," he responds confidently. "And who determined which factors would be weighted most heavily in these assessments?" Again, "My team made those determinations based on business priorities." Alice nods thoughtfully. "Did departments led by white executives operate under identical evaluation criteria as those led by minorities?" Desmond hesitates fractionally. "All departments were held to the same standards of excellence." "That wasn't my question," Alice notes calmly. "Were the specific evaluation criteria identical?" "Different business functions require different metrics," Desmond counters, his composure slipping slightly. "Indeed they do," Alice agrees before displaying side-by-side comparisons on the room's monitors. "Could you explain why minority-led departments were evaluated primarily on short-term profitability, while white-led departments received significant weighting for strategic positioning and future growth potential?" The questioning continues in this vein, systematically dismantling Desmond's narrative of objective assessment. But the true devastation begins when Alice calls her first witnesses, not Pinnacle employees, but executives from other companies where Desmond previously worked. A former colleague testifies about Desmond's candid statements at an exclusive industry retreat. He explicitly described techniques for removing diversity hires without triggering discrimination lawsuits. He called it managing organizational immune response to foreign elements. Another witness, a VP from a competing firm, describes Desmond's behavior at a private club. "He advised me to create impossible performance standards specifically for minority employees, then document every minor infraction while overlooking similar issues from white employees." With each testimony, Desmond's face darkens. His legal team frantically passes notes, strategy crumbling under the weight of consistent accounts spanning his entire career. What emerges isn't an isolated incident or misunderstanding, but a calculated pattern of discrimination executed with increasing sophistication throughout his professional life. When Desmond returns to the stand, his composure has vanished. Under precise questioning about the whistleblower complaint he intercepted, he lashes out. "Gilbert wanted results, not excuses. The diversity mandate was political window dressing, not serious business strategy. I did what was necessary to maintain standards while checking the right boxes for public consumption. So you admit to undermining Pinnacle's diversity initiatives? Alice asks quietly. Someone had to prioritize merit in the face of identity politics. Desmond's voice rises, his carefully constructed professional persona cracking completely. You people always cry discrimination when you can't perform at the level required. The room falls silent. You people, Alice repeats calmly. Desmond realizes his error too late. His final desperate attack targets Alice's character directly. You've never earned anything on merit. Daddy's little princess playing dress-up as an executive, using race as a weapon because you can't compete on ability. The panel chair interrupts, calling a recess. Desmond's attorneys huddle around him, urgently whispering damage control strategies, but his expression shows he already understands what they won't explicitly say. He's destroyed his own case. When the panel returns, their decision is unanimous. Beyond rejecting his wrongful termination claim, they issue a formal censure for professional misconduct and refer the case for potential civil rights violations. Desmond sits motionless as the ruling details how his behavior violated industry ethics standards and potentially federal law. As he gathers his papers with trembling hands, former colleagues avoid his gaze. His phone buzzes, his last potential employer rescinding their tentative offer after witnessing his implosion. Desmond Richards, once on track for a CEO position, now faces a future as an industry pariah. As Desmond exits in disgrace, Alice receives an urgent call. Several other companies are requesting her help in evaluating their corporate cultures. 3 months after the hearing, Pinnacle Industries thrives with renewed energy. The executive floor now features glass-walled offices and collaborative spaces, symbolic of the company's cultural transformation. Quarterly results exceed expectations. Employee satisfaction scores reach record levels, turnover drops 60%, and productivity shows double-digit increases, particularly in previously underperforming divisions now flourishing under new leadership. Alice implements her signature Walk in Their Shoes program, requiring executives to periodically work alongside employees at various levels. Though initially met with resistance from status-conscious executives, the program's results speak volumes. Companies adopting similar approaches report immediate insights into inefficiencies and cultural barriers invisible from corner offices. Pinnacle hosts an industry conference on inclusive workplaces. Gilbert, now in remission, delivers the opening address. I built this company believing I created a meritocracy, but failed to recognize how privilege shaped my perspective. My executive office insulated me from realities immediately visible from the janitor's closet. The conference features reformed executives who previously enabled toxic practices. Thompson admits candidly, I convinced myself certain behaviors were normal. I never questioned who those unwritten rules excluded until facing consequences personally. Industry leaders listen with unprecedented receptiveness, recognizing the competitive advantages of inclusive cultures. Companies begin proactively reviewing their practices rather than waiting for public relations disasters. Jamal now heads Pinnacle's innovation department, where his previously ignored ideas flourish into market-leading technologies. Maria implements groundbreaking human resources policies that become industry standards. As the conference concludes, Alice receives an urgent message from Innovate Tech's CEO. We need your help. Our culture is destroying us from within. Alice studies the message, knowing that transforming the industry's largest company would create a tipping point no competitor could ignore. 1 year later, Pinnacle stands transformed. The company has received multiple awards for workplace excellence and innovation. Employee satisfaction remains at record highs. Alice walks through the open office layout, chatting with employees across departments. She wears business casual attire, another shift from past rigid hierarchies. In her office, a janitor's badge hangs framed beside her degrees. It reminds me that perspective determines what we see, she explains to a new hire. From the CEO's office, you see strategy and metrics. From the janitor's closet, you see people and culture. Both views are essential. Desmond's consulting practice failed, his reputation irreparably damaged. Alice takes no pleasure in his downfall, focusing instead on sustaining positive change without creating new power imbalances. The executive dining room has become a communal space. Alice regularly eats with staff from various departments, today joining Maria and Jamal in the main cafeteria. "Sometimes I can't believe how much has changed," Maria says, watching employees mingling comfortably. "The most significant changes aren't in policy but everyday interactions," Alice observes. "How people speak to each other, who gets heard in meetings." Gilbert approaches their table, now semi-retired and fully recovered. "The board approved the Pinnacle Foundation," he announces, "dedicated to workplace equity initiatives, funded by 5% of annual profits." "How does it feel seeing your legacy evolve?" Alice asks. "Humbling," Gilbert admits. "I never recognized barriers invisible from my perspective until you showed me." Later, Alice meets with Ramon, a newly hired custodian with an environmental science degree. He presents research on sustainable cleaning supplies. Alice listens attentively, then walks him directly to the operations director's office, ensuring he receives proper credit for his initiative. At orientation, Alice addresses new employees. At Pinnacle, position doesn't determine value. Everyone deserves respect. The measure of leadership isn't the power you wield, but how you treat those who can't immediately benefit you. She concludes with the company's new ethos. True character is revealed in how you treat those you believe can't help you. If you enjoyed this story of justice and transformation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Beat Stories for more powerful narratives that will leave you thinking. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads of satisfying revenge, redemption, and life-changing moments.
What happened today isn't just a story. It's a reminder. Silence protects systems, but courage rewrites them. At Beat Stories, we don't just watch change, we document it. Subscribe for more real stories that challenge power and amplify truth.